The scalding heat hit her first, a searing liquid fire that splashed across her forearm and soaked through the thin fabric of her uniform. It clung to her skin, a vicious second skin of burning coffee and bitter humiliation. Then came the man's voice, a whip crack of manufactured outrage in the sudden shocked silence of the diner. "Look what you did! Clumsy idiot! This is a $200 shirt!" Lena stood frozen. The pain was a dull, throbbing roar in her arm, but it was nothing compared to the hot spike of shame that pierced her chest. Every eye in the small, greasy spoon diner was on her. She could feel them. The pity from Mrs. Gable in booth 3, the nervous fear from the two teenagers by the window, the helpless anger from Sal, the old cook, who stood paralyzed behind the grill, spatula in hand. The man, a thick-necked brute with a face flushed with petty triumph, jabbed a finger at the dark, spreading stain on his crisp white shirt. It was a tiny splash, a single drop compared to the deluge that had covered her. This was his stage. She was merely his prop. "Are you stupid? Or just deaf? I said move the cup to the other side," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the cheap linoleum. Lena didn't say anything. She couldn't. The words were trapped somewhere in her throat, strangled by a past she thought she had escaped. A past filled with loud voices and unjust anger. She simply absorbed the blow, as she had learned to do. She endured. It was her greatest strength and her most profound curse. The man, whose name was Frank Grimes, saw her silence not as dignity, but as weakness. It was gasoline to his smoldering fire of inadequacy. This was power. This was control. He leaned in close, his breath sour with stale coffee and self-importance. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just going to stand there dripping all over the floor like the useless mess you are?" He was enjoying this. His eyes, small and dark, glittered with a cruel, hungry light. He was feeding on her humiliation, growing larger and more powerful with every second of her silent suffering. He saw a waitress, a nobody, a fragile little bird he could crush in his meaty fist just for the sport of it. He didn't see the woman who had stared down death in a city park without flinching. He didn't see the woman who had pulled a child from the brink of oblivion with nothing but steady hands and a calming voice. And he had no possible way of knowing that the quiet, unassuming man sitting in the corner booth, the man who had been reading a worn paperback for the last hour, was her husband. He was utterly, fatally unaware that he was publicly humiliating the one thing on earth that Marco the Ghost Bellini had sworn to protect. He had no idea that his world, in all its loud and pathetic arrogance, was about to end. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. All right, back to the story. The day had started like any other Tuesday at the Nightingale diner. Gray light filtered through the large front windows, illuminating swirling dust motes and the faint, greasy sheen on the red vinyl booths. The air smelled of burnt coffee, sizzling bacon, and the faint, sweet scent of the lemon cleaner Lena used on the countertops every morning before the first customer arrived. Lena moved through the space with a quiet, practiced grace. She was a ghost in her own right, but of a different sort. She refilled salt shakers, her movements fluid and economical. She wiped down menus, her expression serene. She greeted the regulars with a small, genuine smile that never quite reached her eyes, but warmed them all the same. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sea, deep and holding secrets she rarely allowed to surface. They held a profound and weary patience, the look of someone who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen, defiantly, to continue offering it the best of herself. She had worked at the Nightingale for 2 years. It was a haven, a quiet port in the storm of her life. The work was simple, repetitive, and honest. It demanded nothing from her but a steady hand and a polite demeanor, two things she could offer without cost to her carefully guarded soul. The owner, a gruff but fair man named Sal, saw her resilience. He never asked about the faint, faded scar that traced the line of her jaw, or why she sometimes flinched at the sound of a dropped plate. He just made sure her coffee was hot and her paycheck was on time. In his own way, he was a protector. The regulars, a collection of lonely old men, tired construction workers, and students from the nearby community college, adored her. They saw her gentleness as a kind of strength. She remembered their orders, asked about their grandchildren, and listened to their rambling stories with an attentiveness that made them feel seen. To them, Lena was a fixture, a quiet constant in a fluctuating world, a soft place to land. None of them knew about the man who dropped her off a block away every morning in a simple, dark sedan. None of them knew about the quiet, sprawling house on the other side of town where she lived. None of them knew that the simple gold band on her finger connected her to a world of shadows and whispers they could never imagine. Her life was a carefully constructed fortress of normalcy, and she guarded its walls with fierce devotion. The bell above the door chimed at precisely 9:47. The sound was jarring, louder than usual. Frank Grimes entered the diner as if he were kicking down a door. He wasn't a large man, but he filled the space with an aggressive, restless energy. He was dressed in a suit that was too tight across the shoulders and a shirt that was a size too small, straining at the buttons. He had the puffed-up posture of a man desperate to be seen as important. He paused just inside the door, his eyes sweeping the room with a look of profound disdain. His gaze dismissed the worn checkerboard floor, the faded photographs of local sports teams on the wall, the handful of quiet customers. He was a predator searching for the weakest animal in the herd. His eyes landed on Lena, and he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was a smirk of assessment, of calculation. He saw her quiet demeanor, her server's apron, her polite, non-confrontational stance, and he filed her away under easy target. "Table," he barked, not as a request, but as a command. Lena, who was refilling a sugar dispenser, turned and gave him her small, professional smile. "Good morning. Just for one?" "What does it look like?" he snapped, gesturing impatiently at his solitary form. "Right this way," she said, her voice even and calm. She led him to a clean booth by the window. He looked at the table as if she'd offered him a seat on a pile of garbage. "No, not this one. The light's in my eyes." The sun was not in his eyes. It was a cloudy day. Lena simply nodded. "Of course. How about this one?" She indicated a booth in the center of the room. He grunted and slid into the vinyl seat, making a show of wiping a non-existent crumb off the surface with his napkin. He tossed the menu down without looking at it. "Water, no ice, and make it quick." Lena retrieved the water, her movements unhurried. She placed it carefully on his table. He watched her every move, his eyes narrowed. He was building a case against her, against the world. He was a man who believed he was owed something, and every interaction was a negotiation to collect that debt. He picked up the menu, scoffed, and threw it down again. "Is this it? This is all you have?" "We have the daily specials on the board over there, sir," Lena said, pointing towards the chalkboard behind the counter. "I can't read that from here," he lied. "You'll have to tell me." So she did. Patiently, she recited the list: meatloaf with mashed potatoes, chicken pot pie, the soup of the day, which was tomato bisque. He cut her off mid-sentence. "Just bring me coffee, black." He said the word black as if it were an insult. This was the beginning of the escalation. It was a pattern Lena knew well, though she hadn't experienced it in a long, long time. It was the testing of boundaries, a series of small pokes and prods designed to see how much a person would take before they broke. First, the coffee was too hot. She brought him a fresh cup. Then, it was too cold. She brewed a new pot just for him. He watched her do it, a smug look on his face. He complained that his spoon was dirty. She brought him another one, wrapped in a napkin. He complained that her shadow was falling across his newspaper. She took a half step back. Each complaint was a small victory for him. Each act of patient service from her was, in his mind, an admission of her inferiority. He was the customer. He was king. She was the servant. She was nothing. The other patrons began to notice. Mrs. Gable lowered her newspaper, her brow furrowed with concern. The two construction workers in the back booth stopped their conversation and watched, their hands curled into loose fists on the table. Old Man Hemlock, a diner fixture who had been eating breakfast at the same table every day for 40 years, narrowed his eyes. He'd seen bullies before. He knew the scent of them. They stank of fear. Their own fear, projected outward as cruelty. Lena felt their collective gaze, their silent support. It was a small comfort, but it was something. She focused on her tasks, moving through the diner, refilling their coffees, clearing their plates, trying to insulate herself in the bubble of her work. But Grimes would not be ignored. He wanted an audience. He cleared his throat loudly, a theatrical, rattling sound. When Lena approached his table, he held up his coffee cup with a flourish. "This is sludge," he announced to the room. "Absolute mud. I wouldn't serve this to a dog." Lena kept her voice low, trying to de-escalate, to shrink the scene he was so desperate to create. "I'm very sorry, sir. I can get you something else. Tea, perhaps?" "I don't want tea," he sneered. "I want coffee. Decent coffee. Is that too much to ask in this dump?" He was baiting her. He wanted her to argue, to get flustered, to cry. He wanted a reaction that would validate his sense of superiority. Lena gave him none of it. "I'll make another pot right away," she said, her voice a placid lake he could not ripple. Her calm was an infuriating denial of his power. It drove him to a place of sputtering rage. He had come here for a fight, for a conquest, and this quiet, unassuming woman was refusing to play her part. She was refusing to be his victim. So he decided he would force her into the role. He waited until she returned with the steaming, freshly brewed coffee. He watched her as she carefully poured it into his cup, her hands steady, her focus absolute. And then he made his move. As she was setting the pot down on the table, he jerked his arm as if startled by a fly. His elbow connected with her wrist. It was a deliberate act, disguised as an accident, a clumsy, violent motion that sent the hot coffee pot tumbling from her grasp. The world went into slow motion. The brown liquid arced through the air. Lena tried to pull back, but it was too late. The scalding coffee splashed across her arm, her apron, the floor. A single, tiny drop landed on his precious white shirt. The ceramic pot hit the linoleum with a sickening crack, shattering into a dozen pieces. And then, the explosion. The final straw had been laid, and now it was broken. Frank Grimes shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the stunned diner. "Look what you did!" he roared, his voice a tidal wave of false fury designed to drown her. "Clumsy idiot, this is a $200 shirt." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the minuscule brown spot on his chest. It was a performance of victimhood, and he was playing it to the hilt. Lena stood perfectly still amidst the wreckage. The shards of the broken pot lay at her feet like shattered stars. The coffee seeped into her shoe, a warm, sticky tide. A blistering red mark was already beginning to form on her forearm, a testament to the heat she had absorbed. But she did not cry out. She did not scream. She did not even flinch. She simply stood there, her head slightly bowed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was a statue of endurance, a monument to quiet suffering. Inside her, a storm raged. The old fears, the old voices, the memories of a man whose anger was just like this, loud, performative, and utterly unjust, threatened to pull her under. But she held on. She had built a new life, a safe life. She would not let this man, this pathetic, cruel stranger, tear it down. The entire room was frozen. It was a tableau of suspended animation. Sal, the cook, held a knife poised over a tomato, his knuckles white. Mrs. Gable's hand was halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The construction workers looked at each other, a silent question passing between them. Should we step in? But they were paralyzed by the modern fear of intervention, of making things worse, of legal repercussions. Grimes fed on their paralysis. It emboldened him. He was the only one moving, the only one making noise. He was in command. Are you stupid or just deaf? He continued his tirade, stepping closer to her, invading her personal space. I said move the cup to the other side. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous hiss meant only for her, but loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just going to stand there dripping all over the floor like the useless mess you are? He wanted to break her. He needed to see her crumble. It was the only way he could feel whole. Lena finally lifted her head. Her eyes met his. There was no fear in them. Not anymore. There was just a deep, profound, and weary sadness. She saw him for what he was. A small, hollow man, trying to fill his own emptiness by carving out pieces of others. She opened her mouth to speak, to say the only thing she could say. I'm sorry. But the words never came out. Because in that exact moment, a new sound entered the charged silence of the room. It was not a loud sound, it was subtle. The quiet, deliberate scrape of a wooden chair against a linoleum floor. The sound came from the corner booth, the one shrouded in shadow, the one that everyone had forgotten about. A man stood up. He moved with a slow, unhurried grace that was utterly at odds with the frantic tension in the room. He was tall, but it wasn't his height that commanded attention. It was his stillness. He was a man who seemed to absorb the sound and light around him, a point of absolute calm in the center of the storm. He wore simple, dark clothes, a black jacket, a gray Henley shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms covered in intricate, faded tattoos that spoke of a life lived far from diners and cloudy Tuesday mornings. His face was all sharp angles and quiet intensity. His dark hair was cut short, his jawline firm, but it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were dark, watchful, and ancient. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. This was Marco, Lena's husband. The air in the room shifted. It was a physical change, as if the barometric pressure had suddenly dropped. The fear, which had been a cloud surrounding Lena, seemed to dissipate and then coalesce, moving, target-like, onto Frank Grimes. Grimes, still puffed up with his victory, didn't notice it at first. He was too consumed by his own performance. He heard the chair scrape and turned, annoyed at the interruption. What do you want? He snapped, ready to add this new person to his list of conquests for the day. Marco didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed only on Lena. On her face, on her arm, on the shattered pieces of ceramic at her feet. He saw the red, angry burn beginning to blister on her skin. He saw the tremor in her clenched fists. He saw the forced stoicism in her eyes, the dignity she was fighting so hard to maintain. And in that moment, something deep inside him, a beast he had long kept chained in the dungeons of his past, stirred and opened one eye. The bystanders felt the shift most acutely. Old man Hemlock, who had seen his share of tough guys and wise guys come through the diner over the decades, felt a cold dread snake up his spine. He recognized the type. This wasn't a brawler or a hothead. This was something else entirely. This was the quiet authority that didn't need to shout. This was the apex predator. He leaned forward, his old heart thudding in his chest. The construction workers, who prided themselves on their physical strength, suddenly felt like boys in the presence of a man. They instinctively shrank back in their booth. Grimes finally registered that the attention of the room was no longer on him. It was on this stranger. And the stranger's attention was on the waitress. Annoyance curdled into confusion in his gut. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, his voice a little less certain this time. Marco took one slow step forward, then another. He moved with the deliberate, fluid silence of a panther. He stopped a few feet away, placing himself between Grimes and Lena, creating a silent, unbreachable barrier. Then, he spoke. His voice was the first command. It was not loud. It was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence of the room like a church bell. It carried an impossible weight, a history of orders given and instantly obeyed. "Lena," he said, his eyes never leaving her face, "come here." It was a request, a plea, and an unbreakable command all at once. For the first time since the coffee had spilled, Lena's composure cracked. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She took a hesitant step toward him, drawn by the absolute safety in his voice. Grimes, oblivious to the tectonic plates of power shifting beneath his feet, saw this as an affront to his authority. The waitress was obeying this stranger, not him. "Hey, buddy, this is between me and her," he blustered, stepping forward and putting a hand on Marco's shoulder. "Mind your own business." It was a catastrophic mistake. The moment Grimes's fingers touched the fabric of Marco's jacket, the temperature in the room dropped another 20 degrees. Marco didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to notice the hand on his shoulder. He simply turned his head, very slowly, and looked at Frank Grimes for the first time. He didn't look at Grimes's face. He looked at his hand. He stared at the 5 fleshy fingers resting on his shoulder with an expression of mild analytical curiosity, as if he were examining a strange insect he was about to crush. A long second passed. Grimes felt a coldness spread from his fingertips, down his arm, and into his chest. It was a primal fear, the instinctive terror of a prey animal that has just realized it has wandered into the den of a sleeping bear. He felt an overwhelming urge to snatch his hand back, but it was as if it were glued there. Marco's gaze slowly lifted from the hand to Grimes's eyes, and for the first time, Frank Grimes felt the first cold finger of true doubt. He saw something in those dark eyes that defied all his life experience. It wasn't anger. It wasn't aggression. It was a profound, ancient, and chilling emptiness. It was the look of a man for whom violence was not an act of passion, but a simple tool, like a hammer or a screwdriver. "You have 3 seconds," Marco said, his voice still impossibly quiet, "to take your hand off me." Grimes's hand flew back as if he'd touched a hot stove. He stumbled back a step, his bravado instantly evaporating, replaced by a clammy, prickling sweat on his brow. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he stammered. But the words had no conviction. They were the hollow echoes of a power he no longer possessed. Marco ignored him completely. His attention was back on Lena. He gently took her unburned arm and guided her away from the mess, away from Grimes, towards the safety of his corner booth. He sat her down on the vinyl seat and then stood before her, his large frame a shield against the world. He looked at her burned arm, his expression unreadable. With an infinite gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his bearing, he reached out and softly touched the skin just below the angry red mark. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice now filled with a raw, aching tenderness that was for her and her alone. Lena just nodded, unable to speak, biting her lip to keep from sobbing. Marco's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible ripple of muscle. He turned his head and looked over his shoulder, back at the now trembling Frank Grimes. The emptiness in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by something far, far worse. A promise. To understand what happened next, you need to know who Marco Bellini was. To the world at large, to the IRS, to the neighbors in their quiet suburban cul-de-sac, he was Marco Bellini, a semi-retired investment consultant who managed a portfolio of overseas properties, a quiet, private man who kept to himself, a devoted husband. But in another world, a world that operated in the shadows and spoke in whispers, he had another name. He was the Ghost. For 2 decades, Marco Bellini had been the head of one of the most powerful and feared criminal syndicates on the East Coast. He had not inherited his position. He had carved it out for himself with a combination of strategic brilliance, unwavering loyalty to his people, and a capacity for swift, decisive action that left his enemies breathless and his allies in awe. He was not a thug. He was a king. His empire was built on a strict personal code. He did not deal in drugs that poisoned communities. He did not tolerate violence against women or children. His business was in the gray areas of life: gambling, high-level logistics, the enforcement of contracts that could never be taken to a court of law. He ruled through trust and respect, but he maintained that respect through an absolute and terrifying reputation. He was called the Ghost because he moved unseen. His name was never in a newspaper, never on a police blotter. He was a rumor, a legend. When problems arose, they simply disappeared. When obstacles presented themselves, they vanished. Marco Bellini did not leave trails. He erased history. But this life came at a cost, a terrible, unimaginable cost. 10 years ago, at the height of his power, a rival faction had decided to break the unwritten rules. They had targeted his family, not him. His family, his wife, Isabella, and his 7-year-old daughter, Sophia. A car bomb, planted outside Sophia's elementary school. Marco had been a block away, on his way to meet them, when he heard the explosion, when he saw the plume of black smoke rising into the sky. The aftermath had been a thing of brutal, bloody legend. In the span of 1 week, every single person involved in the attack, from the man who built the bomb to the boss who gave the order, had vanished from the face of the earth. Not killed in a hail of gunfire. Vanished. Their homes were empty. Their bank accounts were drained. It was as if they had never existed. Marco had exacted his revenge, but it had turned to ash in his mouth. He had looked at his empire, at the throne built on fear and shadows, and saw nothing but the ghosts of his wife and daughter. The power he had amassed was meaningless. It had not been able to protect the only 2 people who mattered. So he had made a decision. He had walked away. He dismantled his own organization with the same quiet efficiency with which he had built it. He pensioned off his loyal soldiers, cut his ties, and erased himself. He became the ghost he was always meant to be, not a specter of fear, but a man haunted by his own past. For 8 years, he lived a life of quiet penance, a life of solitude in the sprawling, empty house that echoed with laughter he could no longer hear. And then he met Lena. It was a day much like this one, gray and unremarkable. He had been in a city park pushing his nephew Leo on a swing. His sister had been sick, and he had agreed to watch the boy for the afternoon. Leo was 5, a whirlwind of energy and joy that was both a comfort and a painful reminder of what he had lost. The boy had been eating a piece of hard candy. One moment he was laughing, the next he was silent, his eyes wide with panic, his hands clawing at his throat. He was choking. Marco, the man who could command armies and make fortunes disappear, was frozen with terror. All his power, all his control, was useless against a small piece of candy lodged in a child's windpipe. He fumbled with the boy, his mind a white-hot blank of panic. And then she was there. Lena. She had been sitting on a nearby bench, reading a book on her lunch break from her job as a paramedic. She saw what was happening and moved without a second's hesitation. "Let me," she had said, her voice calm and authoritative. She didn't wait for permission. She gently pushed Marco aside, knelt behind the gasping boy, wrapped her arms around his small torso, and performed the Heimlich maneuver with practiced, expert force. On the second thrust, the piece of candy shot out of Leo's mouth. He took a huge, ragged, life-giving gasp of air and burst into tears. Lena had held him, murmuring soft, comforting words until his sobs subsided. Marco had just stood there, watching her. He had seen countless acts of bravery in his life, acts of violence and sacrifice, but he had never seen anything like this. This quiet, selfless courage. She hadn't done it for glory or reward. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. She had moved toward the crisis while everyone else was frozen. He had tried to thank her, to offer her money, anything. She had refused it all with a gentle smile. "I'm just glad he's okay," she had said, and then she had simply walked away, back to her life. But Marco couldn't let it go. He was a man who understood debts, and he now owed this woman a debt that could never be repaid. He did what he did best. He investigated. He found out her name. He learned about her life. He learned that she was a hero not just on that day, but every day, working long hours in a stressful job for little pay. And he learned about her past. He learned about the abusive ex-boyfriend she had finally found the courage to leave, a man who still stalked the edges of her life, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. He saw a woman with a core of steel, wrapped in a kindness the world mistook for fragility. He saw a kindred spirit, a fellow survivor. He had arranged to meet her again at a coffee shop. He was awkward, formal. He explained that he was a wealthy man and he wanted to repay her. He offered to pay off her student loans, to buy her a car, to set her up in a new apartment where her ex could never find her. She had looked at him with those clear, stormy eyes and said, "I don't want your money, Mr. Bellini. I just want to feel safe." And that was the moment Marco Bellini's life began again. Safety. That was the one thing he could provide. It was the entire purpose of the power he had once wielded. He had failed to keep his first family safe. He would not fail again. He had made her a promise, a pact. He would be her shield. He would build a fortress of peace around her. And in return, she brought light and life back into his empty world. Their relationship grew slowly, cautiously. It was built not on passion, but on a deep, mutual understanding of pain and survival. They were two broken pieces that somehow fit together to make a stronger whole. They married a year later in a quiet ceremony at City Hall. He had made her one solemn vow. His old life, the world of the ghost, would never, ever touch her. He would be Marco, the quiet husband, and she would be Lena, the kind woman who had saved his world. For 2 years he had kept that vow. Until today. Today, A loud, cruel man in a cheap suit had brought the war to their doorstep, and he had burned the queen. Back in the diner, the air was thick enough to chew. Marco stood over Lena, his back to the room, a silent, menacing monolith. He pulled a clean napkin from the dispenser and gently, so gently, dabbed at the edges of the burn on her arm. Frank Grimes watched, his mind racing. He was a former cop, dishonorably discharged for excessive force, now working a dead-end job as a security consultant for a third-rate firm. He was an expert in one thing, sniffing out weakness and exploiting it. But here, there was no weakness to be found. Only a calm, terrifying strength he couldn't comprehend. His cop instincts, buried under years of bitterness and resentment, were screaming at him. This was not a normal situation. The man's posture, his economy of movement, the absolute control he radiated, it all spoke of a level of discipline and danger that Grimes had only ever seen in training videos about organized crime figures. He tried to reassert himself, to reclaim the narrative. "Look, I don't know who you are," he said, his voice trying for forceful but landing on shaky. "But your friend was incompetent. She ruined my shirt. I want to speak to the manager." Marco didn't turn around. "Sal," he said, his voice calm and even. Behind the counter, Sal the cook flinched as if he'd been tasered. He had never heard this quiet customer speak before today. "Yeah," Sal croaked. "Bring me a first aid kit and a bowl of ice water." It wasn't a request. Sal moved instantly, fumbling under the counter. Marco then turned his head, just enough to pin Grimes with his gaze. "You are the manager," Marco said. It was a statement of fact. "You manage to bring misery with you wherever you go. You manage to mistake kindness for weakness. You manage to be the loudest and least important person in any room you enter." He turned his body fully to face Grimes now. The deconstruction had begun. "You are Frank Grimes, formerly of the 17th Precinct, discharged, not retired, for breaking the jaw of a handcuffed teenager you had arrested for shoplifting. You now work for a company that provides security for strip malls. You are divorced. Your ex-wife has a restraining order against you, and you are 2 months behind on your child support. Your shirt is from a discount outlet and is worth, at most, $24. Every word was delivered quietly. Every word was a perfectly aimed bullet. Grimes's face went from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. The foundations of his world were cracking. How could this man know these things? The sealed records, the private shames, the pathetic details of his failing life? "How?" he whispered, his voice failing him. "My wife is a waitress," Marco said, his voice dangerously soft. "She is the kindest person I have ever known. She endures men like you every single day. Men who think that because she serves them food, she is their servant. Men who believe their small, meaningless frustrations give them the right to treat her as less than human." He took a step closer. Grimes flinched and took a step back. "You did not just spill coffee on her," Marco continued, his eyes boring into Grimes's soul. "You tried to spill your own ugliness onto her. You tried to make her feel as small and as worthless as you feel every single morning when you look in the mirror." The chorus of bystanders watched, mesmerized. This was not a fight. It was an execution. A verbal, psychological dismantling of a bully, piece by painful piece. Sal arrived with the first aid kit and the bowl of ice water. Marco took them without looking away from Grimes. He handed the bowl to Lena. "Put your arm in this," he said softly. Then he turned back to Grimes. "The thing about men like you, Frank," Marco said, his voice taking on a philosophical, almost weary tone, "is that you only understand one language: power. You see a quiet woman in an apron and you see a target. You see me, and now you are afraid. Not because you have done anything wrong. You believe you were within your rights. But because you suspect I have more power than you do. Your entire moral compass is based on who you can kick down and who you have to kiss up to. The bell on the diner door chimed softly. 2 men entered. They were dressed in well-tailored dark suits, a stark contrast to the diner's humble setting. They moved with the same quiet, purposeful energy as Marco. They scanned the room once, their eyes missing nothing, and then they came to a stop just behind Marco's shoulder. They were his lieutenants, Luca and Matteo. Men who had come out of retirement the moment Marco had made a single, silent phone call. Grimes saw them, and a new, more profound terror seized him. These were not cops. These were not businessmen. He knew what they were. He had spent his entire pathetic career dreaming of catching men like this, and now he was trapped in a cheap diner with 3 of them. His bladder weakened. A cold dread washed over him. This was it. This was how it ended. He was going to disappear. They would take him out back, and he would never be seen again. But Marco Bellini no longer dealt in that kind of justice. He had promised Lena a peaceful life, and he had learned that true justice was not about erasure. It was about consequence. Marco turned to Lena. The entire diner, a jury of peers, held its breath. He looked at her, his eyes softening. He gestured with his chin towards the trembling, sweat-soaked wreck that was Frank Grimes. "What do you want, Lena?" he asked. It was the most important question he had ever asked her. He was giving her the power. He was handing her the sword. He would do whatever she asked. If she wanted Grimes hurt, he would be hurt. If she wanted him gone, he would be gone. This was her moment. Her agency. The reclamation of her voice. Lena looked at Frank Grimes. She saw him not as a monster, but as a pathetic, broken man. She saw the terror in his eyes, and it did not give her pleasure. It only deepened her sadness. She thought about her own past, about the man who had hurt her. Violence would not fix this. It would only create more pain, more ghosts. She took her arm out of the ice water. The sting had subsided to a dull throb. She looked back at her husband, the man who was capable of unleashing hell on her behalf, and she chose mercy. "I want him to understand," she said, her voice clear and firm, stronger than anyone in the diner had ever heard it. "I want him to know what it feels like." Marco nodded slowly. He had expected this. He had hoped for it. He turned back to Grimes. The sentence was about to be delivered. "You're a lucky man, Frank," Marco said. "You have been judged not by me, but by the woman you tried to humiliate. And she has chosen to grant you an education." He gestured to Luca, one of his men. Luca stepped forward and produced a slim tablet from his jacket. "As of 5 minutes ago," Marco explained, "your bank accounts have been frozen. Your apartment has been leased out from under you. We paid your landlord a very generous sum to break your contract. The security firm you work for has terminated your employment due to a newly discovered morals clause in your contract. All of your worldly possessions are currently being packed into boxes and delivered to a storage unit, the key to which you will not be receiving." Grimes stared, his mouth hanging open. This was impossible. This was total annihilation, conducted with the speed and precision of a military strike. "You have nothing, Frank," Marco stated simply. "No money, no job, no home. You are now one of the people you so despise, the vulnerable, the weak." He let that sink in. The silence in the diner was absolute. "But," Marco continued, "you have been given a lifeline. Lena volunteers on weekends at the St. Jude's shelter downtown. It's a soup kitchen. Starting tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., you have a new job. You will be washing dishes. You will be mopping floors. You will be serving hot meals to the homeless, the jobless, the people society has forgotten. You will do this for 1 year. You will be given a bed in the shelter and 3 meals a day. Nothing more. Grimes was shaking his head, a low, moaning sound escaping his lips. And you will learn their stories, Marco commanded, his voice hardening for the first time. You will sit with them. You will listen to them. You will look them in the eye and see their humanity. You will learn empathy, Frank. It will be forced upon you until it becomes a part of you. This was the sentence. Not a quick, violent end, but a long, slow, arduous rehabilitation of the soul. It was a punishment more creative and more devastating than any beating. And if you refuse, Marco added, his voice dropping back to a lethal whisper. If you run, if you miss a single day of work, my associate here, he gestured to Matteo, is a journalist. Or at least, he has many friends who are. He has compiled a dossier on you, Frank. Every complaint filed against you, every witness to your bullying that was too afraid to speak up. Your dishonorable discharge, your restraining order. It will all be released. You won't just be a nobody. You will be infamous. A poster child for disgraced civil servants. You will never work in any position of authority again. You will be a pariah. He leaned in close. Lena has given you a chance to become a man. If you throw it away, I will ensure you cease to exist in any meaningful way. Do you understand? Grimes could only nod, tears of self-pity and terror streaming down his face. He understood. He had tried to crush a bird and had brought the mountain down upon himself. Good, Marco said. He stepped back. He gestured to his men. Luca, Matteo, escort Mr. Grimes to his new life. The 2 lieutenants moved in. They didn't grab Grimes. They simply flanked him, their presence an iron cage. He was a broken man. He offered no resistance as they guided him out of the diner and into a black car that had been waiting silently at the curb. And then, he was gone. The aftermath settled upon the diner like a soft blanket of snow, muffling all sound. The tension did not evaporate. It transformed. The fear was replaced by a profound, collective awe. The handful of customers sat frozen in their booths, not as victims of a bully, but as witnesses to a reckoning. They had just seen a monster dismantled, not with fists, but with words and consequences. Marco turned back to Lena. The hardness in his face dissolved, replaced by a deep and abiding concern. He knelt before her in the booth, taking her burned arm gently in his hands. He opened the first aid kit and began to treat the burn with an antiseptic cream, his large tattooed hands moving with practiced delicacy. The silence was finally broken by Old Man Hemlock. He cleared his throat, and everyone turned to look at him. His ancient eyes, usually clouded with age, were sharp and clear. Some people think strength is about how loud you can shout, he said, his voice raspy but firm, carrying across the quiet room. They think it's about pushing people around, making them feel small so you can feel big. He looked directly at Marco, who did not look up from his task. That ain't strength. That's just noise, Hemlock continued. True strength is what we saw here today. It's protecting what you love. It's having the power to destroy a man, but choosing to teach him instead. It's quiet. It's controlled. It's absolute. He then turned his gaze to Lena, and his expression softened. And you, young lady, he said, a note of deep respect in his voice. You showed them what real strength is. You endured. And when you were given the choice between vengeance and mercy, you chose mercy. That takes more courage than anything else in this world. A murmur of agreement went through the diner. Mrs. Gable was dabbing her eyes with a napkin. The two construction workers were nodding, their faces filled with admiration. Sal came out from behind the counter, a plate in his hand. It held a slice of apple pie, still warm from the oven. He placed it on the table in front of Lena. "On the house," he said gruffly, but his eyes were shining with unshed tears of pride and relief. Marco finished bandaging Lena's arm. He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at the faces of her regulars, at Sal, at this dangerous, gentle man who was her husband. She was not just a waitress in a diner. She was part of a community. She was protected. She was loved. She finally gave him a real smile, one that reached her eyes and made them shine like the sea after a storm. "I am now," she said. Marco stood up and looked around the diner at the small group of people who had witnessed this private drama. He gave them a single, slow nod. It was a gesture of thanks, a recognition that they were part of this, that their silent support had mattered. He then helped Lena to her feet. "Let's go home," he said softly. He put a hand on the small of her back and guided her towards the door. As they left, the bell chimed, but this time the sound was not jarring. It was gentle, like a closing chapter. Later, that night, in the quiet of their large, beautiful home, Lena stood on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. Marco came and stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I broke my promise," he said, his voice a low rumble against her back. "I swore that world would never touch you." Lena leaned back against his chest. "You didn't," she said. "That man wasn't from your world. He's from this one. Men like him are everywhere. The only difference is, today, he picked the wrong waitress." She turned in his arms to face him. She reached up and touched the side of his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. "You didn't bring violence into my life, Marco," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that settled deep in his soul. "You brought me peace. You showed me what it feels like to be safe. What you did today, it wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about balance." This was the moral of the story, the truth that settled between them. True strength wasn't about the capacity for violence, but the wisdom of its application. It was about protection, not cruelty. Mercy, they had both learned, could be a far more powerful and transformative weapon than vengeance. Kindness was not weakness. It was a quiet, unyielding force that, when properly defended, could change the world, one broken bully at a time. Silence enables monsters. Community and courage defeat them. "He'll never bother you again," Marco vowed, "or anyone else if we're lucky." "I know," she said. She looked at the white bandage on her arm. It was a reminder not of the pain, but of the love that had healed it. 6 months later, the Nightingale Diner was a different place. The lighting was warmer, the vinyl on the booths was new, and a fresh coat of paint covered the walls. An anonymous benefactor had invested in the business, allowing Sal to hire more staff and expand the menu. The benefactor, of course, was Marco, who had funneled the money through 3 shell corporations so as not to draw attention. Lena no longer worked as a waitress. She was now Sal's business partner, managing the front of the house. She moved with a new confidence, her smile easy and frequent. She still greeted her regulars with the same warmth, but the weary sadness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, steady light. She and Marco had bought the building, ensuring that this small haven would remain a safe place for the community. And Frank Grimes? He was a fixture at the St. Jude's shelter. The first few weeks had been hell for him. He had been sullen, angry, and resentful. But the relentless daily exposure to true suffering began to wear away at his bitter shell. He saw a single mother with 3 children who had lost her job and her home, yet still managed to smile. He saw a war veteran, haunted by ghosts, who shared his meager portion of bread with a newcomer. He saw 100 stories of resilience and grace in the face of unimaginable hardship. He listened, as he had been commanded to do. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, he began to change. The sneer left his face. The aggressive posture softened. He learned to wash dishes without complaining. He learned to look people in the eye when he served them their food. One afternoon, a woman came through the line, her hands trembling from the cold. She dropped her tray, splattering soup and mashed potatoes all over the floor. The old Frank Grimes would have screamed at her. The new Frank Grimes knelt down, put a comforting hand on her arm, and said, "Don't worry about it. It happens. Let me get you another one." He didn't know that Luca, one of Marco's men, was sitting in the corner, dressed as a homeless man, watching. He had been there every day for 6 months, reporting back. That evening, Luca made his report. Marco listened, then hung up the phone. He looked at Lena, who was sitting across from him, reading a book. "His education is complete," Marco said. The next day, Frank Grimes was informed that his bank accounts were unfrozen. A modest sum had been deposited, enough for a deposit on a small apartment and a fresh start. There was also a job offer, a permanent position as the shelter's volunteer coordinator. He took the job. He had been given a second chance, forged in the crucible of his own humiliation and redeemed by the mercy of the woman he had tried to break. He would never be a powerful man, but for the first time in his life, he was on the path to becoming a good one. And in a quiet corner of the city, in a warm and bustling diner, a woman with stormy eyes and a brilliant smile poured a cup of coffee for an old man, her hand steady, her world finally, completely safe.